Hello dear listener, and welcome back to Kingdoms at Night. Tonight, we drift toward one of the quietest and most haunting mysteries in early American history, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. This is not a story to rush through. It is a story of an island, a vanished settlement, a child whose name survived when almost everything else disappeared, and one strange word carved into wood. So make yourself comfortable, let the room grow still, let the outside world soften for a while, and when you are ready, we will follow the sound of the dark Atlantic back to an island where the water is never entirely still. There is an island off the coast of North America where the water is never entirely still. Even on calm nights when the moon hangs low over the Atlantic and the air smells of salt and pine resin and the deep, particular darkness that gathers over marshland, the sound of the sea is always there. A low, breathing sound. The kind that fills a silence without breaking it. The kind that has been there long before any human ear was near enough to hear it. The island is called Roanoke. It sits behind a long, thin ribbon of barrier islands, a place the old maps call the Outer Banks, separated from the mainland by wide, shallow sounds that catch the light strangely in the early morning and hold the darkness strangely at night. Herons stand in the reeds at the water's edge. Deer move through the scrub pines without any sound at all. The marsh grass bends and straightens in patterns that have nothing to do with human time. It is a quiet place now. It was a quiet place then too, in the beginning before the ships came, and it is a quiet place that holds, at its heart, one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Not haunting in the way of ghost stories or ancient curses or legends designed to frighten. Haunting in the older, stranger sense of the word. The sense that means something returns to a place without being able to leave it. The sense that means something incomplete is still trying, quietly in the dark, to finish itself. Over 400 years ago, a small group of English men, women and children came to this island and tried to make it home. They built houses, they planted gardens, they drew maps, they wrote letters, they baptized a child and gave her the name Virginia, and in doing so gave that name to an entire stretch of the continent that had not yet been named at all. And then, sometime in the years that followed, in the gap between one English ship's departure and the next ship's return, they vanished. Not some of them, all of them. 115 people, gone from the island as completely as if they had never been there. No bodies, no graves, no burned buildings, no sign of a desperate flight or a violent end. Just absence where a whole community of living people had been. The only thing they left behind, the only deliberate mark carved into the wood of a post near the entrance to their small fort, was a single word. CROATOAN. That word has been turning in the silence for more than 4 centuries, and still the question remains. What happened to the people of Roanoke? Where did they go? Did they survive? Scattered across the land? Absorbed into the lives of people who had been here long before them? Did something terrible find them in the night? Did they simply walk away from one life and into another, leaving England and its ambitions behind them in the salt air? Did the island itself, patient and indifferent, eventually take them back into its grass and its water and its deep quiet? We do not know, and perhaps that is why this mystery endures. Not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because it sits at the very edge of the human experience of being lost, of disappearing, of leaving behind only the question. Allow yourself tonight to drift into that question. Let the sound of the water underneath everything be the sound of time passing, slow and continuous, and carrying the past forward without ever quite bringing it into focus. We're going back to that island. We're going back to a particular night in August of the year 1590, when an English ship finally returned to Roanoke after 3 long years away, and its captain climbed ashore in the dark and called out into the trees and heard nothing. To understand why those 115 people were on that island at all, you have to understand something about the world that sent them. Elizabethan England was a country that was always looking outward, not because it was especially large or especially powerful in absolute terms, but because it was crowded, in debt, obsessed with its own smallness on the map of the world, and perpetually aware that the great Catholic powers of Europe, Spain especially, were growing rich and strong on the wealth of continents that England had so far only glimpsed from the sea. England in the late 16th century was a country trying to understand what it wanted to become. Queen Elizabeth had been on the throne for nearly 30 years by the time the Roanoke colonists set sail. She had survived plots, excommunications, the threat of foreign invasion, and the long, exhausting religious turbulence of a country that had changed its faith 3 times in 3 generations. She had never married. She ruled alone, brilliantly, cautiously, with a talent for delay that her more impatient advisers sometimes found maddening. She was called the Virgin Queen, and the men who dreamed of English colonies in the New World would eventually name their imagined territory after her. Virginia, the Virgin Land. A continent consecrated, in the English imagination, to a woman who had consecrated herself to her nation. That naming was not incidental. It carried a weight of meaning and longing that the colonists themselves probably felt, even if they did not say so in those exact terms. England wanted something new. England wanted proof that it could claim its place in a world that was being divided up by others, by Spain and Portugal, and the trading empires of Europe that had gotten there first. The New World was not empty, of course. It was filled with people, with nations, with complex cultures and deep histories that stretched back thousands of years. But to the Elizabethan imagination, it was a space of possibility, a place where England could become something different, something larger, something that could not be threatened or besieged or excommunicated or confined to its cold, damp, island-shaped edges. This was the dream, and like most dreams, it was more complicated in practice than in thought. The man most responsible for the Roanoke expeditions was not himself a sailor or a soldier, though he was in some ways a soldier in spirit. His name was Walter Raleigh, later Sir Walter Raleigh, knighted for his efforts, though the knighthood would not save him in the end. He was tall, flamboyant, ambitious, a poet and a courtier, and a man who understood that in Elizabethan England, access to the Queen's favour was the most valuable currency of all. He never actually went to Roanoke himself. The letters patent that authorised the colonial venture were his, the funding was partly his, the political will behind it was partly his, but his feet never touched the soil of that island. He worked at a remove, pulling strings, writing letters, sending ships. He was working from an idea that had been planted in his imagination partly by his older half-brother, Humphrey Gilbert, who had his own failed attempts at colonial ventures in the New World, attempts that ended when Gilbert's ship went down in the Atlantic in a storm, and the last anyone saw of him was standing on the deck of the sinking vessel holding a book, supposedly shouting that the sea was no wider in the darkness than in the daylight. That image, the drowned man with his book, making philosophical pronouncements as the water rose, tells you something about the particular mixture of bravado and melancholy that attached itself to Elizabethan ventures into the unknown. These were people who understood that what they were attempting was dangerous, and who chose to frame that danger in the language of courage and destiny rather than in the language of good sense. They were not unaware of the risks. They simply believed, or needed to believe, that the risks were worth taking. The first English expedition to the area around Roanoke arrived in 1584. It was not a settlement expedition, it was a reconnaissance mission. 2 small ships carrying a small crew, sent to look at the land and report back on what they found. The men who went on that first voyage came back speaking in superlatives. The land was beautiful, the soil was rich, the waters teemed with fish and the forest with deer, and the air itself seemed different, warmer, softer, more welcoming than anything England had to offer. The people they encountered, members of the Algonquian-speaking nations who had lived in this region for generations beyond counting, seemed friendly and dignified. Two of them, named Manteo and Wanchese, agreed or were persuaded to return with the English to London, where they would spend the winter learning English and serving as living proof of the New World's potential. What those two men thought of London, of its cold, its noise, its dense crowds, its utterly alien ways, is not recorded anywhere that has survived. We know they were there. We know that a man named Thomas Harriot, a scientist and linguist of real brilliance, worked with them to learn the basics of their language and to teach them English. We know they returned on the next expedition. But what passed through their minds in that long, strange winter, in a city that must have seemed as bizarre and incomprehensible to them as their own world seemed to the English? That is one of the countless silences in this story. There are so many silences. In 1585, Raleigh sent the first real expedition, a military and colonial force of about 100 men under the command of Sir Richard Grenville, a naval commander of fierce competence and even fiercer temper. They landed at Roanoke in the summer of that year and began to build a fort and a small settlement on the northern end of the island. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Grenville, who was not a man given to patience or diplomacy, managed to burn a Native American village over a stolen silver cup. The incident was small in terms of its immediate consequences, but it was devastating in its symbolic meaning. These were people, the Roanoke, the CROATOAN, the CROATOAN and others, who had their own complex political lives, their own alliances and grievances and carefully maintained balances of power. The English, arriving with their firearms and their military organisation, and their tendency to respond to perceived slights with overwhelming force, inserted themselves into that world clumsily, thoughtlessly, and with consequences that would ripple outward in ways none of them fully understood. Grenville left that autumn, sailing back to England for supplies, leaving behind about 107 men under the command of a man named Ralph Lane. Lane was a soldier, practical and hard-edged, with the kind of mind that was good at fortifications and logistics, but less good at the long, patient work of building a relationship with people whose help he desperately needed. The winter that followed was difficult. Supplies ran short. The relationship with the local Algonquian people, the CROATOAN and their neighbours, frayed further and then broke. By spring, Lane had launched a preemptive strike against a CROATOAN leader named Wingeneur, whom he suspected, possibly with some justification, possibly not, of planning an attack on the colony. Wingeneur was killed. That too sent ripples outward. And then, in the early summer of 1586, the great English naval hero Sir Francis Drake arrived at Roanoke on his way home from raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean. He offered the struggling colonists a choice: take passage home with him, or take some of his ships and supplies and try to hold on longer. Lane chose to leave. They all did. They sailed back to England, leaving the little fort on Roanoke Island empty, and the question of the colony's future entirely unresolved. A few weeks later, Grenville's supply ships arrived from England. They found an empty fort. They left 15 men to hold the place and sailed home, those 15 men who were left behind. We know almost nothing about them, their names, their reasons for staying, what the remaining months of their presence on the island were like. We know only that when the next expedition arrived the following year, they were gone. Some bones were found, widely scattered, a skull perhaps. The small fort was overgrown. 15 people, absorbed into silence. The story of Roanoke is, in many ways, a story about what happens to people when the support systems that were supposed to sustain them fail to arrive. It is a story about the gap between the world as it was imagined in England, in the warm, firelit rooms where men with maps and plans and ambitions talked about what they were going to build, and the world as it actually was, out there on that barrier island where the wind came off the water and the night was very dark and help was always much further away than anyone had promised. By 1587, the Roanoke venture had already failed twice. Anyone with clear eyes and a practical mind might have concluded that the island was not the right location, that the whole project needed to be reconsidered, that the lessons of the first two expeditions needed to be absorbed before a third was attempted. But the dream does not give up easily. Walter Raleigh tried again. This time the plan was different. Not a military garrison, but a true civilian colony. Not soldiers, but settlers, families. People who were coming not to hold a strategic position, but to make a life. Among the 115 people who sailed in the spring of 1587, there were women and children. There were married couples. There were craftsmen and farmers and ordinary people who had, for reasons that varied from person to person and that we can only partially imagine, decided to stake their futures on a place most of them had never seen and could not quite picture from the descriptions they had heard. The governor of this new colony was a man named John White. John White is one of the most important figures in this story, not because of any military or political achievement, but because he was an artist. He had been on the 1585 expedition, and during that time he had done something that no one else had done or would do for decades. He had painted the people and the landscape of the Carolina coast in careful, beautiful detail. His watercolours of the Algonquian people, their faces, their postures, their ceremonies, their towns, are among the most precious documents of that encounter. They are the only visual record we have of how those people lived before the English presence irreversibly changed their world. John White saw things, he recorded them. He was a man who paid attention, which makes it all the more meaningful and more heartbreaking that he would spend the rest of his life on the other side of the ocean, unable to see what was happening to the people he loved most. The colonists arrived at Roanoke in late July of 1587. Almost immediately they found themselves in a situation that must have felt very precarious. The 15 men left by Grenville the previous year were gone. All that remained were those scattered bones and the overgrown fort. The captain of their transport ship, a man named Simon Fernandez, was uncooperative and seemed more interested in privateering against Spanish ships than in ensuring the colonists were properly established. Relations with the CROATOAN and other neighbouring peoples remained tense after the violence of the Lane expedition. But the CROATOAN, the people who lived on a neighbouring island to the south, for whom the carving on the post would one day be named, were different. Manteo, who had twice travelled to England and spoke both English and Algonquian, was CROATOAN. He served as interpreter, go-between, the human bridge across the gap of language and understanding that separated two very different worlds. Through Manteo's connections, the colonists had at least one line of communication, one thread of possible alliance with the world around them. On August 18th, 1587, a child was born on the island. She was the daughter of Ananias Dare and Eleanor White Dare, Eleanor being the daughter of John White, the governor. The baby was given the name Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Her baptism was recorded, the date noted. She was given her name, and in that act of naming she was given a kind of permanence, a place in the written record, a thread connecting her to the world of England and letters and official documentation. Virginia Dare was 9 days old when her grandfather John White sailed back to England. He did not want to go. By all accounts, he argued against leaving, but the colony needed supplies urgently, and there was no one else with sufficient authority and knowledge of the venture to make the case properly in London. He was, in some sense, the only person who could do it. He left, promising to return as quickly as possible. He kissed his daughter and his granddaughter, and he walked down to the water and he sailed away. He did not know, as he watched the island shrink behind the stern of the ship, that he would not see it again for 3 years. He did not know that when he finally returned, they would all be gone. John White landed back in England in the autumn of 1587, carrying with him the needs and hopes of 115 people who were waiting on an island 4,000 miles away. He found a country on the edge of war. The relationship between England and Spain had been deteriorating for years, through the conflicts in the Netherlands, through the execution of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, through the endless privateering raids on Spanish shipping that Elizabeth sea captains conducted with her tacit approval. By the winter of 1587-88, it was no longer really a question of whether the two countries would go to war, but of when, and in what form the war would come. The answer arrived in the summer of 1588, when the Spanish Armada, the great fleet assembled by Philip II to carry an invasion force across the English Channel, appeared in the waters off the English coast. The defeat of the Armada is one of the defining moments in English history, the subject of a mythology that grew rapidly and did not stop growing for centuries. What it meant for John White and the colonists at Roanoke was something more specific and more terrible. It meant that every ship in England was needed for the war effort. The Queen issued an order forbidding vessels of any size to leave English ports. The resupply mission to Roanoke was impossible. White spent the winter of 1587-88 trying to find a way around this. He managed eventually to obtain permission for 2 small ships to go, and then, in a development that must have felt like the hand of fate pressing down on him personally, the ships were intercepted by a French privateer. One of them was damaged so badly it had to turn back. The other pressed on and reached the vicinity of Roanoke, but the captain lost his nerve, or ran out of time, or calculated that the risks outweighed the rewards, and turned around without landing. The colonists had now been alone on that island for over a year. The war with Spain extended its shadow over everything. For the people of England, these were years of genuine fear. Fear of invasion, fear of the kind of destruction that had rolled across other parts of Europe during the religious conflicts of the century. For White, they were years of a more particular and more private anguish. He knew, or suspected, in the way that people suspect the worst when the silence becomes long enough, that every passing month was a month in which something irreversible might be happening to his daughter and his granddaughter, and the 100 other people for whom he felt some measure of responsibility. What did he do in those years? He wrote letters. He appealed to Raleigh and to anyone else with influence and ships. He waited. He went on waiting. We do not know what John White dreamed about at night. We do not know what Virginia Dare looked like as she grew from an infant into a child who could stand and walk and say words in whatever language the world around her was teaching her to speak. We do not know whether Eleanor Dare, watching the seasons change on that island, still believed her father was coming. It was not until the summer of 1590 that John White finally found a way back to Roanoke. He secured passage on a privateering expedition, not a dedicated resupply mission, but a venture whose main purpose was raiding Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. White had to negotiate for the privilege of being taken along at all. He was essentially a passenger, dependent on the goodwill of men whose priorities had nothing to do with his colonists. It was not the return he'd planned, it was the only return available. The ships reached the Caribbean in the summer, did what they had come to do, pursued and fought and plundered Spanish vessels in the way of the time, and then turned north toward the Carolina coast. The night of August 15th, 1590, 2 ships lying off the Outer Banks in darkness. The men on board could see a light, or what looked like a light, burning somewhere toward the north end of Roanoke Island. They tried to launch boats to go ashore, but the sea was rough, and the shoals around the Outer Banks were treacherous, famous for their treachery for the ships they had swallowed over the years. One of the boats capsized in the surf. Men were lost. White could hear the fire, or what sounded like a fire, burning somewhere in the darkness. He was so close to the island he had left 3 years ago that the sound of it was real. But the sea stood between him and the island, and the sea was not cooperative. The following day, August 17th, they managed to land. What White found, or rather, what he did not find, is the pivot point of the entire mystery. The houses were gone, not burned, not visibly destroyed, just gone, as if they had been carefully dismantled. The settlement had been overgrown with trees and high weeds. In 3 years, the vegetation had moved back in, quietly and completely, over whatever human traces had been there. The fort had been pulled down, or most of it. The enclosure that had once contained the settlement was partly gone, but not everything was gone. On one of the trees near the entrance to what had been the fort, carved deeply and clearly into the bark, was the word CRO partway there. Something, or someone, had begun the carving and not finished it, or had carved the beginning of a word that continued elsewhere. White walked further and found another post, or perhaps it was a tree. Accounts differ slightly on this point, and there, carved in larger, more deliberate letters, was the complete word, CROATOAN. He had agreed with the colonists before he left 3 years ago on a signal. If they needed to move from their location, they would carve the name of their destination. If they were in distress, if the move had been forced rather than chosen, they would add a cross, a mark of danger, above the letters. There was no cross, there was only the name, carved clean, carved without panic, without apparent urgency. A message from someone who had time to carve it carefully, a signpost rather than a cry for help. CROATOAN, the island, the people. Manteo's home, 40 miles or so to the south. The people who had been the colony's one consistent ally. White was reportedly not afraid. He was, or so he wrote later, hopeful. The absence of the cross meant, in his reading of the agreed signal, that this was a voluntary departure, not a flight. He believed they had gone to CROATOAN Island. He wanted more than anything to go there. But the sea once again refused. The ships were in poor condition after months in Caribbean waters. Supplies were low. The water casks had been damaged in the rough surf the previous day. The captains were reluctant. Roanoke Island was already a detour from their original purposes. CROATOAN Island would be another 40 miles, more difficult waters, more time. Storms were coming. It was hurricane season on the Carolina coast, and anyone who had spent time in those waters knew what that meant. White argued. He pleaded. He was, after all, a man whose daughter and granddaughter and 100 other people might be only 40 miles away, might be alive and well and waiting. He convinced the captains to agree to one attempt. They would try for CROATOAN Island, they would try. The attempt failed. The storm came. The anchor cable snapped in the heavy seas. The ship was driven south and then east, away from the coast entirely. By the time the weather cleared and the captains took stock of where they were and what they had, there was nothing left in the way of will or resources or favourable circumstances to justify another attempt. They sailed for England. John White never returned to the New World. He never saw his daughter or his granddaughter again. He spent his remaining years, we don't know exactly how many, because the date of his death is uncertain, somewhere around 1593 or a few years later, writing letters and accounts of what he had seen and what he had found and what he had not been able to find. His last known letter contains a sentence that is one of the most quietly heartbreaking things in the entire historical record of this era. He writes of the fate of the colonists that he commits the matter to the mercy of God and trusts that he will be with them in spirit if not in body. The mercy of God. He had run out of other options. After White, the silence deepens. Raleigh made a few more attempts to investigate, to send ships, to find out what had happened. None of them succeeded. The privateering wars with Spain consumed energy, and attention and money. The colonies drifted to the edges of national consciousness, replaced by more immediate concerns. Virginia, the name and the dream, lay dormant for nearly 20 years. It was not until 1607, 20 years after the colonists vanished, that the English returned to the region in force, establishing the Jamestown colony further north on the Virginia coast. Jamestown itself nearly perished several times in its early years. The story of early English colonization in North America is largely a story of near failure and tremendous human cost. But Jamestown survived, and the Virginia Company with it, and slowly the project of English settlement in the Americas began to take root. When the Jamestown colonists arrived, they heard stories. The Native American people of the region, the Powhatan Confederacy and its many member nations, had knowledge of what had happened in the South, on those barrier islands and the coastline around them. There were rumours, passed along through trade networks and diplomatic contacts and the ordinary channels through which information moves between communities, that some of the Roanoke colonists were still alive somewhere, integrated into Native American communities. Captain John Smith, the complicated and frequently self-aggrandizing chronicler of Jamestown, mentioned these stories. So did others. The chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, a man the English called Powhatan, his actual name was Wahun Seneca, reportedly told the colonists at Jamestown that some survivors of the Lost Colony had lived among the Chesapeake people, a nation to the north of his territory, for some years before he destroyed the Chesapeake in a war motivated partly by political calculation and partly by a prophecy that a nation from the east would one day overthrow his own. Whether this story was true, whether it was strategically modified in the telling, or whether it was designed to serve Powhatan's own purposes in managing the new English presence, no one can say for certain. Stories, rumours, fragments carried across linguistic and cultural barriers, reshaped by each retelling. The records tell us what survived, but not everything that was lost. And then there are the other stories, scattered through the decades that followed, in the journals and accounts of explorers and traders and colonial officials who moved through the region. There are occasional references that catch the eye. Reports of grey-eyed Native Americans, reports of people in the interior who spoke a few words of English, reports of communities that seemed to have absorbed some European cultural practices or physical traits, reports of a people, further inland, who remembered ancestors who wore European clothing. Each of these reports, taken alone, is a thread. None of them, alone, is enough. But together they form something, not proof, but the outline of a possibility, a ghost image of a story that might have happened, the word carved into the post, the name that White found and read as a signpost, the single most important surviving trace of what happened to those 115 people, CROATOAN. The CROATOAN were a people of the southern Outer Banks. Their main territory was on a large island to the south of Roanoke that is today called Hatteras Island. They were Algonquian-speaking, part of the same broad cultural and linguistic world as the Secotán and the Roanoke and the Powhatan, related but distinct, with their own political life and their own particular history. They had been the colony's friends, or something close to friends, from very nearly the beginning. Manteo was CROATOAN. His mother, who held an important leadership position in her community by all accounts, had dealt with the English with a combination of watchfulness and diplomatic skill that suggests a person who understood, better than most, that these newcomers required careful management. The CROATOAN had not burned villages over stolen cups. They had maintained the relationship. They had kept the thread of alliance alive even when other threads were fraying. So when the colonists carved that word, they were naming a place they knew, a place where at least one person among them, Manteo, would be recognized and welcomed, a place that had been part of the colony's world from the beginning. Perhaps that is where they went. The theory that the colonists moved to CROATOAN Island today's Hatteras Island, and were absorbed into the Croatoan community is, for many researchers, the most plausible single explanation for their disappearance. It explains the carving, it explains the absence of violence, of bodies, of burned buildings, it explains why there was no cross, the distress signal. They were not fleeing in panic, they were going somewhere they believed was safe. They were going to people who, they had reason to hope, would help them. The Croatoan community had something the colonists desperately needed: knowledge. Knowledge of the land, the sea, the plants, the animals, the water sources, the weather patterns. Knowledge of how to survive in a world that the English, despite all their technology and organisation, still fundamentally did not understand. 3 years on the island, with unreliable supplies and deteriorating relations with the surrounding nations, would have made it very clear to the colonists that survival required something they did not have on their own. Perhaps they understood this. Perhaps the decision to leave Roanoke and go to Croatoan was not a desperate last resort, but a practical choice, made by people who had been thinking about it for a long time, and had concluded reasonably that their best chance of surviving was to move toward the one community that had shown consistent goodwill toward them. What happened after that? How the two communities merged? What compromises were made? What was given up and what was gained? How the children who grew up in that combined world understood themselves is something we can only imagine. But perhaps the most important thing to understand about this possibility is what it would have meant for the colonists individually. Think of a woman named Eleanor White Dare, who had been born in England and grown up in a world of a particular kind, a world of churches and markets and family networks and written language and the particular social fabric of Elizabethan life, and who now found herself on a barrier island in a place that had no English name, with a child who was growing up learning whatever language the world around her was speaking. Think of what it would mean to choose to go further into that world, to leave behind the settlement, the fort, the English-built houses, the marks of home that had been created with such difficulty and such hope. To take your child and your neighbours and the few possessions you could carry and walk down to the water and climb into boats and go south to an island where the people who lived there might take you in. This is not a story of defeat if it happened this way. It is a story of transformation, of people remaking themselves in a new world, of a community choosing survival over the performance of an identity that the circumstances no longer supported. It would have taken courage. It would have taken humility, in the deepest sense of the word. The willingness to become a stranger in someone else's home, to learn and adapt and change in ways that would have been invisible from the outside but must have felt vast from the inside. Virginia Dare, if she lived, would have grown up in that transformed world. She would have been 3 years old when her grandfather's ship appeared offshore, too young to understand what that ship meant, or who the bearded man on board might have been if he'd managed to land. She would have grown up speaking the language of the people around her, or perhaps both languages, the English her mother and father would have tried to preserve, and the Algonquian tongue of the Croatoan community. She would have known the sounds of the water and the smell of the marshes and the particular way the light falls on those barrier islands in the late afternoon, golden and low, throwing long shadows across the sand. She would have been a real person in a real place, with a name and a face and a childhood that no one who was not there can see. The answer, if it ever existed, has faded into silence. But the Croatoan theory, as compelling as it is, does not stand alone. The mystery is wider than a single possibility, and the historians and archaeologists who have spent their careers on this question have traced other paths through it, other possible fates for those 115 people. One possibility is dispersal, the idea that the colonists did not move as a single community but scattered in multiple directions, some going to Croatoan Island, others going inland or moving along the coast toward the Chesapeake Bay, where Raleigh had originally intended the colony to be established before the sea captain Fernandez had, for reasons that have never been entirely clear, deposited them at Roanoke instead. The Chesapeake Bay was a more protected harbour, a better location, more suitable for the kind of permanent colony that Raleigh had envisioned. Perhaps some of the colonists, on their own or in small groups, had decided to complete the journey that the ships should have taken them on originally. There is some evidence, fragmentary, suggestive, inconclusive in the way that all the evidence connected to this mystery is inconclusive, that people resembling the Roanoke colonists were living among the Chesapeake people at the southern end of the bay in the years between 1587 and 1607. The account from Powhatan that Captain Smith recorded at Jamestown mentioned people living among the Chesapeake who had European skills and possibly European tools, people who could work with copper and who had houses with stone walls, skills and materials unusual for that region in that period. Whether this was the Roanoke colonists or some of them, or a distorted account of some other contact, or a story constructed for political purposes, these are questions that cannot be answered definitively from the records we have. Another possibility waits in the shadows of Spanish intelligence. The Spanish, who already controlled vast territories in the Americas and who considered the Carolina coastline to be within their sphere of influence, were well aware of the English colonial attempts at Roanoke. They had sources, informants, intercepted letters, the natural efficiency of a maritime intelligence network that was the most sophisticated in the world at the time. They knew about the colony, and they considered it a threat, not because 115 English settlers were a military danger, but because English presence on the Carolina coast represented the thin edge of a wedge that could only grow thicker over time. There are Spanish documents from the late 1580s that mention the English colony and discuss the possibility of sending a force to destroy it. Whether such a force was ever actually sent, whether Spanish soldiers or agents were responsible for the colony's disappearance, is, again, uncertain. No Spanish record describes such an action being carried out, but the absence of a record is not the same as the absence of an action. The Spanish were perfectly capable of conducting covert operations without leaving documentary traces, and then there is the possibility that sits most quietly in the background, the one that requires the least elaboration because it is the most familiar, the possibility that the colonists simply did not survive, that they were overtaken by disease, or starvation, or violence from communities that had every reason to distrust them, or by the accumulated weight of a situation that was never as manageable as anyone had hoped, that they died in various ways at various times and were buried or scattered in ways that left no trace. Death in the 16th century left fewer permanent marks than we might expect. Wooden structures decay quickly in a warm, damp climate. Bones scatter and sink. Graves without markers become invisible in a decade, in 2, in 5. The organic materials that might have told a story, fabric, leather, food, tools made of wood, disappear into the soil. What remains is stone and fired clay and metal, and even these erode and sink and become indistinguishable from the natural landscape given enough time. 3 years was long enough for the settlement to be overgrown. 400 years has been long enough to bury nearly everything else. People have been looking for physical evidence of the colony's fate for a very long time. The search has been conducted at various levels of rigour, with various instruments and methods, and with results that have consistently been interesting enough to fuel continued searching without ever quite resolving the fundamental mystery. The most intensive archaeological work at the Roanoke site itself has uncovered traces of the 16th century occupation, post holes indicating where buildings stood, artefacts consistent with Elizabethan material culture, small objects of metal and ceramic that could only have been brought from England. The site is real, people were there, but the archaeology of the site, as careful and thorough as it has been, cannot tell us where those people went when they left. More provocative, in some ways, are the finds that have been made away from the island itself. on Hatteras Island, the former CROATOAN territory, archaeological work has uncovered materials that appear to date from the 16th century and that include items of European origin. A signet ring, fragments of what appears to be European-style copper, small objects whose presence in a non-European context requires explanation. These finds are consistent with a community that had contact with European settlers, consistent with, though not conclusive proof of, the presence of Roanoke colonists among the Croatoan people. Further inland, in the Piedmont regions of what is now North Carolina, there has been sustained attention to the Lumbee people, a Native American community whose history, identity and origins have been the subject of debate, controversy and deep emotional investment for centuries. Some members of the Lumbee community have long maintained a tradition linking their ancestry to the Roanoke colonists, and there are elements of their documented history that are suggestive, though the question of the Lumbee's specific origins is genuinely complex and involves multiple possible threads. The Lumbee themselves have their own views on this question, and those views are not monolithic. It is a community that has been forced to define and defend its identity in the face of bureaucratic, legal and political pressures that have nothing to do with the mystery of a 16th century colony. Their history is their own, and it deserves to be treated with the respect and care that the history of any living community deserves. There have been attempts to find evidence in DNA, to look for genetic markers in communities that might have absorbed European ancestry in the relevant period. But the methods involved are imprecise, and the conclusions slippery. Genetics can tell us that European ancestry entered a population. It cannot tell us when, or from whom, or in what circumstances. Perhaps the most haunting physical find connected to this story is also one of the most debated. In the 1930s, a man found a stone in a swamp in South Carolina. A large flat stone covered in what appeared to be carved text. The text, when translated, claimed to be a message from Eleanor White Dare, describing the deaths of colonists from illness and attack, giving names, describing the trail of their journey westward from Roanoke. The stone became known as the Eleanor Dare Stone, and for a brief, extraordinary period it seemed like it might be the breakthrough that historians have been waiting for. The voice from the other side of the silence. More stones were found, 48 of them eventually scattered across a vast area, all purporting to continue the same narrative. The whole assemblage told a story so vivid and so complete that it should perhaps have been immediately suspicious. It was eventually exposed as almost certainly a fabrication. The stones had been planted by a man who, for complex and not entirely clear reasons, had manufactured the evidence out of a combination of academic ambition and personal peculiarity. The Eleanor Dare stones were a hoax. What makes this episode interesting in the long view is not the hoax itself, but the hunger it fed. People wanted those stones to be real. People wanted Eleanor Dare's voice. People wanted the silence to break, for someone who'd been in that place to speak across the centuries and say, here is what happened, here is where we were, here is what the mystery contains. That longing has never been satisfied. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between memory and ruin. In recent decades, a discovery in an unlikely place has added a new layer to the mystery. Not a discovery on the ground, but a discovery on paper. The British Museum holds a map of the Virginia coast drawn by John White himself. The governor, the artist, the man who sailed away from his daughter and never came back. White drew this map during the 1585 expedition, and it is an astonishing document of its time, accurate in its outlines in ways that later cartographers would rely on. It shows the coast, the rivers, the islands, the locations of Native American towns. For decades, it sat in the collection as a historical document of known significance. Then, in 2012, scholars using advanced imaging technology looked more closely at the map and found something that no ordinary eye would have seen. Beneath one of the patches on the map, a patch that appeared to be a correction, a piece of paper glued over an earlier version of a coastline, there was a symbol, a red and blue marking hidden under the patch, invisible to the naked eye but revealed by the imaging technology. The symbol appeared to mark a location well inland on the Chowan River in what is now the interior of North Carolina. A fort symbol perhaps, a mark indicating a specific location of significance. What did it mean? Why had White hidden it? Was it a planned secondary location for the colony? A retreat point agreed upon before he left, somewhere the colonists could go if things at Roanoke became untenable? Was it a meeting place? A refuge? No one knows. The hidden symbol raises the question, but does not answer it. It adds another layer of deliberate concealment to a story already made of silences and elisions. It suggests that there was a plan, that the departure from Roanoke, if it happened, may not have been spontaneous or desperate, but organised and anticipated, that there was a place on the map that was known to White and possibly to the colonists, a point marked for a reason that White did not want others to see at a casual glance. Another path through the mystery opens up, another direction in which those 115 people might have gone. The answer, if it ever existed, has faded into silence. Beyond the human mystery, the questions of where and why and how, there is the land itself. Roanoke Island has not remained static. The coastline of the Outer Banks is one of the most dynamic shoreline environments in the world, constantly shifting, eroding, rebuilding, moving. The barrier islands that form the Outer Banks are not permanent geological features. They migrate, they change shape, they disappear and reappear as the sea and the wind and the sand renegotiate their arrangement over time. The inlet through which White ships sailed, the one called Port Ferdinando on his maps, has closed completely, filled in by sand, and exists now only as a name on old charts. The site of the original fort and settlement on Roanoke Island may, in part, have been consumed by the water. Some archaeologists believe that a significant portion of the 16th century occupation area is now underwater, reclaimed by the Roanoke Sound. This is not a metaphor, though it functions like one. The physical record has literally been erased, not by human hands but by the patient, in different work of water and time. And yet the island remains, smaller than it was perhaps, differently shaped than it was in 1587, but there, the pine trees and the scrub oak and the marsh grass, the herons and the deer, the sound of the water at night, that low and constant breathing. There is a place on the northern end of Roanoke Island where the state of North Carolina has maintained a site called Fort Raleigh National Historic Site. It is a quiet place. There are walking paths through the low woods, interpretive signs that give the historical outline of the story, a small reconstructed earthwork meant to represent the original fort, though the reconstruction is approximate, the original location not entirely certain. There is a garden called the Elizabethan Garden, planted in memory of the colonists, full of plants that would have been familiar to an English person of the 16th century. People come to this place and stand in the shade of the trees and look at the earthwork and try to feel, across the distance of 4 centuries, something of what it was like to stand here in 1587, surrounded by a new and incomprehensible world, waiting for a ship that would take too long to come. It is hard to feel it. The distance is too great, and yet the place holds something. Not evidence, not an answer, but a quality of attention, a sense that something happened here that has not finished happening, that continues in the questions people bring to it and the silence that greets those questions, and the way eventually everyone who comes here walks back to their car and drives away, leaving the trees and the birds and the quietly breathing water to hold what cannot be held any other way. Something essential is missing from every account of the Roanoke mystery, and it is not a lack of facts or dates or locations or archaeological evidence. What is missing is the perspective of the people who were already there, the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Carolina coast, the CROATOAN, the Secautan, the Roanoke, the Wepameoc, the Chowan, and the many other nations who lived in that region in the late 16th century, had their own version of every event that is recorded in English sources. They had their own understanding of who the English were and what they wanted and whether they could be trusted. They had their own political calculations, their own fears, their own reasons for the alliances and conflicts that shaped those years. They had names for the English, names we do not know. They had stories about the ships that appeared offshore, stories told around fires in languages that the English could not follow, stories that continued to circulate long after the English records went silent. Those stories are largely lost to us. The process by which Native American oral traditions survive or fail to survive. The disruptions of European colonization is not a simple story. Some traditions were preserved with extraordinary care, passed from generation to generation through centuries of dispossession and violence and forced transformation. Some were lost entirely, broken by the deaths of the people who held them. Some survive in fragmentary or transformed versions, stripped of context by the circumstances of their preservation. What we know about the CROATOAN and their neighbours in the period of the Roanoke colony comes almost entirely from English sources, from the accounts of men like Thomas Harriot and John White and Ralph Lane, who were trying to understand a world they had arrived in as strangers, and whose understanding was inevitably incomplete, skewed by their own assumptions and limitations. Harriot was more careful and more curious than most. His account of the people he met, and of their religion and their social practices, is a document of real anthropological value. But it's still an outsider's account, filtered through the categories of Elizabethan thought and the purposes of a man who was ultimately employed by people who wanted to colonize the land he was describing. Thomas Harriot. He is worth pausing over. He was, in many ways, the most intellectually serious of all the people connected to the Roanoke venture. A mathematician, a linguist, an astronomer, he made observations of Halley's Comet and other celestial phenomena that placed him among the significant scientific minds of his era. He had learned the Carolina Algonquian language from Manteo and Wanchese during that winter in London, well enough to communicate with people in the field. He was genuinely curious, not merely diplomatically or strategically curious, but personally and intellectually drawn to understanding the world he found himself in. His book about the Carolina coast, published in 1588, is a careful and surprisingly sympathetic account. Sympathetic, that is, for its time and context, of the people and the landscape of the region. He describes the Algonquian people's religious beliefs with something like respect, acknowledging complexity and depth in a tradition that most of his contemporaries would have dismissed as superstition. He describes the plants and animals with a naturalist's precision. He describes the geography with a surveyor's care. He also describes something else, something that the English explorers of that era noticed repeatedly, and that made them profoundly uncomfortable even as they were powerless to prevent it. In the settlements where the English lived or visited, people began to die. Specifically, Native Americans began to die, from diseases they had never encountered before, against which they had no immunity, which swept through communities with a speed and completeness that seemed to the survivors like nothing natural. Entire towns were dying. People who had been healthy when the English arrived were sick and dying within days or weeks. The English themselves were largely unaffected. Harriot writes about this with a mixture of observation and theological interpretation that reveals something important about the gulf of understanding between the two worlds. The Native American communities, he observed, had concluded that the English must be supernatural beings, or that the English God was killing their enemies on their behalf. Harriot, who was personally uncomfortable with this conclusion apparently, tried to explain that the deaths were natural phenomena, not divine intervention. But the deaths continued, with the relentless logic of epidemic disease among a population with no prior exposure. And whatever Harriet's explanations and discomforts, the biological reality was doing its work regardless of anyone's intentions or interpretations. The CROATOAN and their neighbours in 1587, by the time the civilian colony arrived, had already lived through years of contact with the English. They had seen the diseases. They had survived, or not survived, the particular kind of crisis that epidemic mortality creates. The loss of elders, of knowledge holders, of the people whose deaths leave gaps that cannot be filled, the deaths of children who had not yet learned what their parents had known. They had survived the burning of villages and the political violence of the Lane expedition. They knew better than the colonists knew themselves what the English presence meant. And yet the CROATOAN had not withdrawn. They had maintained the connection. They had kept Manteo as a go-between, a living bridge. They had accepted the colonists' friendship, or something that functioned like friendship, even knowing what friendship with the English had cost other people. Why? Perhaps because they understood that the English were coming regardless, and that having some influence over the relationship was better than having none. Perhaps because Manteo, who had seen both worlds, had counselled a strategy of engagement. Perhaps because the people in that particular community had their own reasons, economic, political, personal, for preferring alliance to isolation. Perhaps simply because the CROATOAN leader, whose name and thoughts and feelings are not preserved anywhere in the historical record, made a judgment that this was the better path, and her community trusted that judgment. We do not hear their own songs. We do not know what they called their children. We do not know which gods they whispered to when the night was dark. Virginia Dare. The name has a weight in American cultural memory that is disproportionate to what we actually know about her. She was born on August 18th, 1587, on Roanoke Island to Eleanor and Ananias Dare. She was baptized 9 days later. She vanished with all the rest. That is everything we know about her as a specific individual, and yet she's become, over the 4 centuries since her birth, a figure of enormous symbolic significance. In the mythology of American beginnings, she represents something particular. The first English child born in what would become the United States, the very beginning of a new population in a new place, the original American in a certain kind of telling of the national story. She has been commemorated in art and literature, turned into a symbol of innocence and potential by generations who found in her story something they needed to find. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, she was sometimes romanticized in ways that said far more about the romanticizers than about the historical reality. Reimagined as a beautiful young woman, given fictional adventures, placed at the center of stories that were really about different anxieties entirely. But if we try to put the mythology aside and think about her as a real person, a human being who was born on a particular day, who had a mother and a father, who grew up somewhere, the mystery takes on a different texture. What did Virginia Dare become? If she survived the first years on Roanoke Island, she would have been a toddler when the colony moved, old enough to walk but not old enough to understand anything of what was happening. She would have grown up in whatever community received the colonists, absorbing the language and practices and worldview of that community in the way that children always absorb the world around them, without resistance or nostalgia for what came before. She would not have remembered England. She would not have remembered the house her parents built, or the sound of her grandfather's voice, or the particular feel of being an English person in an English place. That world would have been, for her, entirely theoretical, a story her mother might have told her, a language she might have learned alongside the other languages of the world she actually inhabited. She might have grown up to have her own children and grandchildren, and some part of what made her who she was. The English blood, the English names she may or may not have kept, would have continued forward in time, diluted and transformed and embedded in a community that was itself transforming. Or she did not survive. She was a child in conditions that were difficult for adults, in a time when childhood mortality, even in the most comfortable circumstances, was high, in a situation that was not comfortable at all. The early years on that island, before any move to CROATOAN or wherever they went, must have been hard. The years immediately following could have been harder. We do not know. The question breathes quietly in the space between what we know and what we imagine, and it does not resolve itself, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some questions are not meant to be answered. Some questions are meant to be carried, long before John White, long before Raleigh, long before the dream of English colonies in the New World. The people of the Carolina coast had been living in that landscape for thousands of years. The Outer Banks are an ancient place in the human sense, not just the geological one. People fished those waters and hunted those forests and built their communities around those sounds for generation after generation, back into a past so deep that it has no written beginning. The Algonquian-speaking peoples whom the English encountered in the 1580s were the inheritors of a long tradition of habitation and adaptation. People who had developed, over centuries, an intimate knowledge of how to live in a place that demanded specific skills and specific knowledge. The land tells you things, if you have learned to read it. The behavior of the birds tells you where the fish are. The color of the water tells you the depth and the current. The direction of the wind tells you what weather is coming. The specific plants that grow in specific places tell you what the soil contains, what water is near, what time of year it is. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, tested against reality, refined and corrected and passed forward, is not less sophisticated than the knowledge encoded in English books and maps. It is differently recorded and differently transmitted, but it is real knowledge, hard-won, specific to this place. When the English arrived, they were strangers to everything. The land did not speak to them in a language they understood. The birds told them nothing. The plants were mysterious. The weather patterns were unfamiliar. Even the quality of the light was different from what they knew, more intense, more subtropical, with a summer heat that English bodies and English constitutions had not evolved to manage easily. They were, in the most literal sense, lost. Not geographically lost. They had maps, rough ones, but serviceable. Lost in the sense of being alien to the world around them, of not knowing what it was trying to tell them, of having no store of accumulated knowledge, no deep familiarity, no generations of ancestors who had worked out how to read the particular text of this place. They needed the knowledge that the CROATOAN and their neighbours possessed. They needed it the way a person needs air, not as an optional supplement but as a fundamental requirement of continued existence. And perhaps the CROATOAN knew this. Perhaps the offer of hospitality, if an offer was made, if the colonists arrived at CROATOAN Island and were received rather than repelled, came with an implicit understanding that what was being offered was not just shelter, but a way of learning to be in the world again. Imagine it. The colonists leaving Roanoke Island in whatever boats they could manage, loaded with what they could carry, moving through the shallow sounds in the direction of CROATOAN. The water in those sounds has a particular colour, a brownish green, tannin-stained, rich with life. Herons stand in the shallows. Pelicans pass overhead in their ancient, prehistoric-looking way. The barrier islands are low and densely vegetated, the pine trees and scrub oak and wax myrtle making a dark line against the sky. They had crossed a threshold. They were not going back. The children on those boats, Virginia Dare among them, too young to understand, held in her mother's arms, would grow up on the other side of that threshold. They would learn the names of things in a language their grandparents had not known. They would learn which plants were useful and which were dangerous, how to read the weather, how to move in this particular landscape without being destroyed by it. They would become over time part of this place. That is one version of the story, one path through the mystery, and there is a strange beauty in it, not in the loss of what they had been, but in the possibility of what they became. There is something worth noting about where this mystery is located, geographically, historically, emotionally. Roanoke sits at the beginning of the American story in a particular and specific way. It precedes Jamestown, which survived, and Plymouth Rock, which became the founding myth. It is the episode before the official beginning, the thing that happened before the story that Americans tell about themselves starts. The vanishing colony, the mystery before the history. This positioning gives it a particular quality. It exists in a kind of pre-national space, before the United States, before the colonial project had fully taken hold, before the specific tragedy of what would happen to the indigenous peoples of the continent had fully revealed its shape. It is a moment of encounter, of contact, of the meeting of two worlds at a point before either had fully understood what the meeting would mean. The English colonists and the CROATOAN people, in this early moment, were not locked into the roles that history would later assign them. The future had not yet happened. The catastrophe was not yet complete. The relationships being negotiated on that island and across those shallow waters were still genuinely open, still being shaped by the choices of individuals, the accidents of weather and supply, the particular personalities of the people involved. Manteo moved between worlds. He was CROATOAN by birth and by culture. He was also someone who had seen London, who spoke English, who understood the English world from the inside in a way no other person in that region did. He was, in his own person, a version of what the meeting of those two worlds might have been if it had gone differently, or rather, a version of what it actually was in its most human particularity, before the larger forces of history settled the question on other terms. His story, too, is largely lost to us. We know he returned from England on the 1587 expedition. We know he was baptised in the English church on the island, a ceremony that must have meant different things to different people present, depending on what they understood about it and what they believed about the world. We know that Raleigh gave him a title, Lord of Roanoke and Dasamunkapus, a gesture that was both meaningful and slightly absurd, the kind of English bureaucratic formality that imposed its categories on a world that did not operate in those categories. And then he vanishes from the record along with everyone else. If the colonists went to CROATOAN Island, Manteo would have been central to whatever happened there. He was the connection, the translator, the person through whom both sides understood each other. He would have been, in some sense, responsible for making the merger work, for mediating the inevitable tensions and misunderstandings of communities trying to become one thing where they had been two. What did he make of all of it? What did a man who had been to London and back, who had been baptised in an English church and given an English title and worked alongside English scientists and artists and soldiers, think when he stood between those two communities and tried to make a future out of the wreckage of everyone's plans? We do not know. His voice is one of the loudest silences in this story. When we talk about the Roanoke colony, we almost always talk about what happened, the disappearance, the mystery, the question mark, but it is worth spending time with what was lost, in the ordinary human sense of things that were there and then were not. John White's paintings were not lost, they survived, and they are extraordinarily beautiful, quiet, careful, respectful images of people going about their lives along the Carolina coast in the 1580s. They show men fishing and women preparing food and ceremonial dances in the interiors of long houses and the geography of specific villages. They are a form of preservation, a record of a world that was, even as White painted it, beginning to change under the pressure of the contact he was part of. But the colony itself produced losses of a different kind. There were among those 115 people, certainly, people of ordinary and extraordinary gifts, craftsmen and farmers and teachers and perhaps writers, people who had stories to tell, people who had learned things from the world around them that no one else in England knew, people who, if they had been able to come home and write about what they had experienced, would have added something irreplaceable to the sum of human knowledge. We do not have what they would have written. We do not have the account of living through a Carolina winter in a small English-built house surrounded by an unfamiliar world. We do not have the diary entries of Eleanor Dare as her daughter learned to walk and then to talk in the particular circumstances of that island. We do not have the letters that the settlers might have written to each other, to their families in England, the ordinary written life of a community that was also trying to document itself for a future audience. Those documents, if they were written, and they may have been written, people write in difficult circumstances, often more in difficult circumstances than in easy ones. Those documents were not preserved. Whether they were lost to weather and time and the process of dissolution, or whether they were deliberately destroyed, or whether they were never written at all, or whether they exist somewhere unsuspected in a private collection or an archive that has not yet been properly examined, we do not know. What we know is only a fragment. There is also the loss on the other side of the encounter, the losses that are harder to account for because they happen to people whose world was not organised around the written preservation of records. The CROATOAN people, whatever their relationship to the Roanoke colonists was or became, were a community in the process of enormous disruption. The diseases that had already arrived with earlier expeditions continued to work their terrible logic. The political consequences of being friendly with the English, consequences that included the hostility of other Native American communities who had good reasons to distrust anyone associated with these newcomers, were real and ongoing. The world that the CROATOAN had inhabited for generations was being redrawn, not just metaphorically but literally, as the pressure of European interest in the coast began to build in ways that would eventually overwhelm everything. We see this from the English side, through English sources, with the particular myopia that any inside perspective carries. The CROATOAN of the 16th century would have seen something different. They would have seen the beginning of something they could not yet know the shape of. They would have had their own ways of making sense of what was happening, their own traditions of understanding the arrival of strangers and the disruption of established orders. They would have had their own fears and their own hopes and their own theories about what the future might bring. Those perspectives are gone from us. And in that going, something is lost that no amount of archaeological excavation or documentary research or genetic analysis can fully recover. The inner life of people in the past, what they worried about when they lay awake at night, what they told their children about the world, what they believed happened to the dead, and what they hoped for in the living. This does not leave traces that instruments can read. It only leaves questions. Why does this particular mystery endure? The question is worth asking slowly, because the answer is not simply that the mystery is unsolved. There are thousands of unsolved historical puzzles that attract minimal lasting attention. Something about Roanoke in particular has kept people returning to it, century after century, with fresh questions and fresh searches and fresh theories, and the same fundamental inability to close the loop. Part of it is timing. The colony disappeared right at the beginning of the American story, before the archives were deep enough to answer questions, before the networks of trade and communication were dense enough to leave multiple independent records of events. It sits at the edge of the historical record where documentation becomes thin and speculation becomes necessary. This makes it genuinely mysterious in a technical sense. Not just unsatisfying, but actually unknowable with what we have. But there is something else. Something in the human quality of the mystery. A community of 115 people. Not a city, not an army, not an abstraction, but a community. people with names and relationships and children, people who had decided to make a specific place their home, people who, in their own minds, were not doing something grand and historical but something ordinary and necessary, trying to survive, trying to build something lasting, trying to give their children a future. They're not unlike people in every era. The particular difficulties of their situation, the isolation, the insufficient supplies, the hostile environment, the vast distance from anything familiar, are specific to their time and place. But the underlying human project is not specific at all. It is the project of every community that has ever tried to make a life in difficult circumstances. The project of survival, of homemaking, of continuing. When they disappeared, they took that project with them. The mystery of their fate is, in some sense, the mystery of what happens to an ordinary human effort when it encounters forces too large to manage, when the ships don't come in time, when the politics of a distant country absorb the resources that were promised, when the world refuses to be as manageable as the plan assumed. There is also something in the mystery that speaks to the experience of loss itself. John White, sailing away from his granddaughter and his daughter, would have experienced something that people who have been separated from those they love by circumstances beyond their control, by war, by migration, by illness, by the simple impossibility of return, recognize across the centuries. The inability to know, the waiting that does not end, the particular anguish of a question that has no answer. He wrote about committing the matter to the mercy of God. That language, the language of someone who has exhausted human options and has nothing left but hope and prayer, carries a kind of weight that does not need the 16th century's specific idioms to communicate itself. The experience behind the words is universal. The feeling of having done everything possible and found it not enough. The feeling of love that cannot accomplish the thing it most wants to accomplish. This too is in the mystery, and perhaps that is why the mystery endures, because it holds, inside its unanswerable question, a reflection of experiences that people continue to have. The lost people of Roanoke become, in this view, not just historical curiosities, but figures for something deeper, for the fragility of human connection, for the permanence of absence, for the way that people continue to matter to each other across distances and silences that ought to be unbridgeable. White looking at the carved word and thinking, they told me where they were going. They were careful to leave the message. They did not want me not to know. That gesture, the carving of the word, the deliberate communication across an anticipated absence, is an act of love, or something that functions like love, a reaching toward connection in conditions of disconnection, a refusal to simply disappear without leaving a trace. Maybe the deeper mystery is not how they vanished, but that they tried, in leaving, to make sure they would not be entirely lost. The work of understanding what happened at Roanoke has never really stopped, even when it has moved slowly or been overtaken by other concerns. In recent decades, the archaeology of the site and its surrounding region has become more sophisticated, more careful, and more collaborative, involving archaeologists working with descendant communities and indigenous scholars who bring different perspectives and different questions to the physical record. The result has been a richer, more complicated picture of what the 16th century Carolina coast was like, and what the encounter between the English colonists and the Algonquian peoples actually involved. The work on Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan territory, has been particularly significant. The site known as Cape Creek has produced a collection of material that includes objects of clear European origin mixed with Native American material from the relevant period. These objects include a fragment of what appears to be a European iron ring, pieces of copper worked in the European fashion, and most intriguingly, a small stone or glass object identified as a Renaissance-era European material, found in a context that suggests it was in the possession of someone who was using it within the CROATOAN community. These finds do not prove that the Roanoke colonists were there. 16th century European trade goods circulated widely through indigenous networks across eastern North America. An object of European origin in a CROATOAN context might have arrived through trade rather than through direct contact with the colonists, but the concentration of such objects and the particular period they date to is consistent with the colonists having been present, with the word carved in that post having been an accurate description of where at least some of them went. The archaeology is careful and measured. The archaeologists who work at these sites are clear that what they have found is suggestive, not conclusive. The physical record is not dense enough or specific enough to close the question. What it does is make the CROATOAN hypothesis more plausible, more grounded in material reality, less purely speculative. The work on the inland sites, in the Piedmont regions that John White's hidden map symbol seems to point toward, is younger and less fully developed. But it too has produced material that is worth attention. A small site near the Chowan River has yielded European artifacts in a context that appears to be roughly contemporaneous with the colony period. What the site was, a trading post, a meeting point, the remains of a settlement, is not yet clear. The patient Earth holds what it holds, and it gives up its information slowly, in fragments, in pieces that require careful context and careful interpretation before they mean anything at all. The archaeology of this period and this region is difficult work, done under conditions of imperfect preservation, with imperfect dating methods, and the constant awareness that any given find could mean several different things. But it continues. People continue to look. There is something moving about that persistence. The centuries-long effort to find out what happened to those 115 people. The question has been asked and re-asked across generations that did not know each other, by people with different methods and different assumptions and different reasons for caring. The question has survived longer than the people who first asked it. It has become, itself, a kind of tradition. The ongoing project of trying to understand, trying to close the gap, trying to hear through the silence. The search is a form of remembrance. The search says, those people existed. Their disappearance matters. We have not stopped caring what became of them. And still, the question remains. Not just the factual question of what happened, though that question is real and important and has not yet been answered to anyone's full satisfaction. The deeper question, the one that sits beneath a historical puzzle like a foundation beneath a house. What does it mean to disappear? Not in the dramatic or sensational sense, not in the sense of mystery novels or conspiracy theories. In the simple human sense, to be present one day and absent the next, to have been alive in a specific place, part of a specific community, part of the texture of the world, and then not to be. To leave a space where you were, to leave people who look for you and cannot find you. This is the condition that the Roanoke mystery inhabits. It is a mystery about presence and absence, about what it means to matter to others and then to disappear from their lives, about the grief of the searcher, John White sailing back to England for the last time, leaving the mystery unsolvable behind him, and the silence of those who are left, about the way that people we cannot find continue to occupy space in our minds, continue to be real to us in their absence as they were in their presence. Every person who has ever lost someone without explanation, without closure, without a body, without an ending that can be understood and processed and accepted, knows something of what that mystery contains. The Lost Colony is, among other things, a very old story about the specific grief of not knowing. But there is another way to think about the disappearance. If the colonists went to CROATOAN Island, and if they were absorbed into that community, And if they survived and had children and grandchildren, and the long, slow continuation of a human life, then they did not disappear in the deepest sense. They transformed. They became something new, something that the people who were looking for them could not recognize or find, because they were looking for something that no longer existed in the form they remembered. This is also a human experience. The experience of becoming so different from what you were that the people who knew you no longer see you in what you've become. The experience of change so radical that it looks, from the outside, like disappearance. Perhaps the people of Roanoke didn't vanish. Perhaps they arrived. Perhaps they came to CROATOAN and were taken in, and learned the language of the marsh and the sound, and learned to read the water and the birds, and gradually stopped being the English colonists of Roanoke and became something that didn't have an English name. Perhaps they became part of the long, continuous human story of that coast, the story that had been going on for thousands of years before the ships came, and that continued in changed form for generations after the last ship stopped coming. In that version of the story, the mystery is not about death or destruction. It is about transformation, about the way that cultures and communities and identities are not fixed things but living things, things that change and blend and become new things under pressure, about the possibility that disappearing from one world is not the same as ceasing to exist. Maybe Virginia Dare grew up. Maybe she raised children in a world she understood from the inside in a way her grandfather never could. Maybe there are people alive today who carry, unknowingly, something of what she was. Not just her genetic material, but the accumulated choices and adaptations of the people who came before them. The long, slow work of survival and transformation. Maybe the answer has been there all along, dispersed and invisible, hidden in plain sight in the continuing presence of people who have been in this land for longer than the mystery has been asked. Return, for a moment, to the word. CROATOAN. John White stood in front of that carved post in August of 1590 and read a message that he had agreed upon in advance. He had half expected it, or something like it. He had known when he left that the colonists might need to move, and he had arranged for exactly this kind of message, and he saw the message, and he understood what it was supposed to mean. And then the weather and the circumstances and the practical realities of the situation conspired to prevent him from following that message to its destination. How close he came. 40 miles, if the seas had been calmer, if the anchor cable had held, if the captains had been more willing, if any one of 100 small contingencies had fallen differently. He was 40 miles away from an answer he could have found. And instead the ships turned east, and the coast receded, and the mystery settled in. That word carved into the wood was the last deliberate communication from those 115 people to the world that had sent them. It was meant to be a message, not a mystery. It was meant to say, "We are here. Come find us. We are safe." It was meant to close the gap, to reach across the absence. Instead, it became the symbol of the gap itself. This is perhaps the most affecting thing about it, a gesture of communication that became, through the accident of events, the central artifact of a mystery, a word designed to speak that has spent 4 centuries in silence. The carver, whoever it was, one of the colonists tasked with leaving a clear message for White, did their work carefully. The letters are described as large and clear, deeply carved, meant to be unmistakable. There was no cross above them. The carver wanted White to know that this was not a distress signal. This was a direction, a pointing toward. Look here, come here. We went this way, and we hear it across 4 centuries as a question rather than an answer, as the beginning of a mystery rather than its resolution, as the last word of a story that does not have a last chapter. What were the nights like on Roanoke Island in 1587? The summer nights of the Carolina coast are warm and thick with sound. with the chorus of insects, the calls of night herons, the low, constant music of the water moving against the shore. The sky, in a place with no artificial light, would have been alive with stars. The particular deep starfield of a coastal night, with the horizon flat and low and the sky immense above it. The colonists going about whatever night routines they had established, setting watches, banking fires, putting children to sleep in those small English-built houses with the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar continent around them, would have looked up at those stars and seen the same stars they had seen in England, the same constellations, the same arrangement that had guided sailors across the Atlantic to bring them here. The sky did not change. The sky connected them to everything they had left behind, to the people who were still in England looking at the same stars from different ground. But everything below the sky was different. The sounds were different. The smell of the air was different, warmer, stranger, full of the particular sense of this specific place, resin and salt and the rich organic smell of the marshes. The darkness had a different quality than English darkness. The animals that called in it were not English animals. They were somewhere new. They were somewhere they had never been. And the night, which is the same everywhere and also utterly specific to every place, held them in a world they were still learning to know. The CROATOAN people, 40 miles to the south on their island, had their own nights, their own fires, their own children going to sleep with the same sound of water around them, the same insects, the same stars, their own watching of the horizon, where English ships had appeared before and would appear again, their own conversations about what these strangers meant, what they wanted, what the future was going to look like, and somewhere between those two communities, on the water that connected them and separated them, on the barrier islands and the sounds and the marshes and the pine forests that neither community owned in the permanent sense but both inhabited, somewhere in all of that, the mystery assembled itself. Not in any dramatic moment, not in any single event, but in the accumulated choices and accidents and acts of survival that turned a colony into an absence and a name on a post into 4 centuries of wandering. After all the theories, all the archaeology, all the documentary research and the genetic analysis and the satellite imaging and the archival work, after all of it, we do not know what happened to the people of Roanoke. We know they were there. We know they carved a word. We know John White found the word and could not follow it. We know that subsequent searches found nothing. And after that, silence. But the silence is not empty. The silence is full of the traces and suggestions and possibilities that 4 centuries of patient inquiry have accumulated. The silence has a shape, the shape of the mystery itself, which is not formless but has specific contours, specific places where the outline of a possible answer can be felt even when it cannot be seen. The CROATOAN connection is real. The material evidence from Hatteras Island is real, even if it is not conclusive. The hidden symbol on White's map points somewhere, even if we don't know exactly what it points toward. The stories told to the Jamestown colonists carry some kind of information, even if the information has been shaped by the telling. The traditions of the Lumbee and other communities in the region carry something forward, even if what exactly they carry remains debated. The absence is not absolute. The vanishing was not complete. There are threads. The threads are thin, and they lead in several directions and they fray before they reach any definitive conclusion. But they are there, and there is one more thing that remains. The name: Virginia Dare, Eleanor White Dare, Ananias Dare, John White, Manteo, the 111 others whose names are mostly lost even to the historical record. These names are still here. They have been said and written and remembered for 4 centuries, carried forward through the very act of wondering about them, sustained by the mystery itself. The names of people who disappeared are a kind of presence. Not the presence of the people themselves which is gone, but the presence of the relationship between the past and those of us who look back at it. The presence of the question. As long as we ask the question, as long as anyone says, where did they go? What happened to them? Did they survive? Those names remain in the world. They continue to exist in the only way that any person can continue to exist after death, in the minds of those who remember them. The Roanoke colonists are, in this sense, among the most persistently remembered people in American history. Not because they did something great or achieved something lasting or left behind monuments, but because they disappeared in such a way that their disappearance could not be accepted, could not be closed, could not be filed away and forgotten. Because the mystery they left behind is the kind that pulls at the human mind and will not let go. They are remembered because they are lost, and being lost in this particular way has kept them near. There is a word that sometimes comes up in discussions of mysteries like this one. The word is apophenia, the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random or incomplete information, to see faces in clouds, to find narratives in fragments. It is a real tendency, and it has been responsible for many false leads and false conclusions in the history of the Roanoke mystery, including the Eleanor Dare stones. But there is a different thing that the Roanoke mystery does, something that is not about false patterns, but about genuine incompleteness. The historical record for this period is genuinely fragmentary. The events took place before the systems that would later produce dense and overlapping documentation were in place. There are real gaps where there might have been information and is not. The question is not a projection onto blankness. The question arises from real absence. And something about real absence asks to be acknowledged differently than false mystery. Real absence, the actual non-existence of records and bodies and traces that should be there, has a different quality than the manufactured mystery of a hoax. It has a gravity to it, a weight. John White's loss was real. Eleanor Dare's life and Virginia Dare's life were real. The choice to carve that word into the post was real. The failure of the ships to arrive in time was real. All of these things happened, and they happened to specific people who felt them as specifically as any of us feel the real events of our own lives. The mystery is made of real things. Real lives, real losses, real choices. The question of what happened is a real question about real people. And the fact that it cannot currently be answered, maybe cannot ever be fully answered, does not make it less real. It makes it more. There is something in the nature of this particular mystery that resonates with the way that absence works in human life more broadly. We all carry in our memories versions of people who are no longer with us, people who are present in our lives and then cease to be present for whatever reason. And the versions we carry are always incomplete. We remember what we saw and felt and experienced, but we do not have access to the full interior life of the person we remember, the private thoughts and dreams and fears, the moments we were not present for, the self that existed beyond our experience of them. In this sense, everyone we remember is, to some degree, as lost to us as the Roanoke colonists are to history. Not absolutely lost. We have more. We have direct memory and relationship, but incompletely present only in fragment. The Roanoke mystery is an extreme version of something that is true in ordinary life, the extremity of it, the completeness of the disappearance, the 4 centuries of silence, makes visible something that is usually obscured by the everyday presence of the people we know. It makes visible the way that other people are always, to some extent, unknown to us, always to some extent elsewhere. The tide on the Outer Banks runs on its own schedule, indifferent to what people need from it. It ran like that in 1587, and it ran like that in 1590 when John White came back, and it runs like that still. The water does not hold the story in any recoverable form. It has moved over and through and past that story continuously for 400 years, wearing away at it, dissolving it, carrying it further out to sea, and yet there is a way in which the mystery persists not in spite of its irresolvability but because of it. The questions that cannot be answered become part of the way we hold the past. They become the negative space through which the outline of the past is defined, not by what we know, but by what we do not know, not by the presence of the record, but by the particular quality of its absence. Roanoke is defined by its question mark. The question mark is the shape of it, the way it sits in historical memory, the way it keeps calling people back. Without the question, there is no mystery. Without the mystery, there is only the story of a failed 16th century colonial venture, historically interesting perhaps, but not resonant in the deeper sense. With the question, the story becomes something else, something that reaches past the specific historical circumstances and speaks to experiences that have nothing to do with Elizabethan colonialism. When archaeologists dig at the Cape Creek site on Hatteras Island, they're doing more than looking for objects. They're asking a question on behalf of everyone who has ever asked it. They are participating in a centuries-old conversation that has not reached its conclusion. When researchers examine the hidden symbol on John White's map, they are doing the same thing, following a thread, trying to close a gap that has been open for 400 years. When the Lumbee people maintain and defend their identity and their history, they are doing something that may or may not be directly connected to the Roanoke colony, but that is connected to the same long story of encounter and survival and transformation that the colony is part of. They are living evidence that people adapt and continue. The mystery does not live only in the archives. It lives in the land, in the communities, in the continuing human presence on that coast. And it lives in something else too, something harder to name. It lives in the gap between what John White hoped when he saw that carved word and what happened when the seas refused him his answer. In that gap, between the message and the receiver, between the signal and its destination, is something that does not resolve. Something that sits in the chest when you read his accounts, when you follow the trajectory of his life toward its quiet, unresolved ending, when you try to imagine what it was like to be him, carrying that unfinished question through whatever years remained to him. He tried. He failed. Not from lack of love or effort or determination. He failed because the world is large and the sea is powerful, and the forces that move ships are indifferent to what any individual person needs from them. The mercy of God. He wrote those words and stopped. That stopping, the place where language fails and the only thing left is silence and whatever comfort lies beyond language, that is where the Roanoke mystery ultimately lives, in the silence after the last word. The night deepens over the outer banks. The stars, where they are visible between the clouds, are the same stars that were there in 1587. Not the same individual stars, most of which are too far away to have changed in 4 centuries, but the same arrangement, the same patterns, the same constellations that the Roanoke colonists would have known by their English names, and the CROATOAN people would have known by names we do not have. The water moves against the shore with the same rhythm it has always had, older than any human presence on the island, indifferent to the human meaning that has accumulated around it. The marsh grass bends and straightens. The herons stand motionless in the shallows. The night insects sing their particular song, which is the song of this specific latitude and climate, the song that has been sung here since long before the English ships came. The island is quiet. It holds, in its soil and its water and its darkened air, the traces of what happened here. The post holes, the artifacts, the patterns left by people who built and planted and lived and ultimately left. It holds those traces without explanation, without narrative, without the kind of clear and unambiguous record that would allow us to say, Here is what happened. Here is where they went. Here is the end of the story. The island keeps the mystery the way a landscape keeps any deep event that happened in it. Not as memory, landscape does not remember, but as texture, as the particular shape of things that carries, encoded within it, the pressure of what occurred. There is a path through the trees at the northern end of the island near the reconstructed earthwork of the fort that leads to the edge of the sound. At the right time of year, at the right time of day or of night, the view across the water has something of the quality it must have had when this was a new and barely mapped place. The water is wide and still and dark. The far shore is a dim line. The sky is the sky. If you stand there long enough, something in the mind begins to do what the mind does when given sufficient quiet and space. It begins to project backward, to imagine, not to know, but to imagine. The boats moving across the water in the gathering dark, the sound of oars, the loaded boats, heavy with what the people could carry, moving away from the island they had tried to make into home, moving toward an uncertain welcome, in the direction of a word that had not yet been carved but would be carved before they left. They looked back at the island from the water. They must have. Human beings look back at things they are leaving. It is an instinct deeper than thought. What did they see looking back? The trees, the shape of the fort they had built, the graves if there were graves by then, the particular quality of the afternoon light, or the morning light, or whatever light it was when they went. And then the island grew smaller behind them, and the water grew wider between them and it, and they faced forward into whatever was coming. There is one more thing to sit with, before the night grows too deep for words. The Roanoke mystery is sometimes described as America's first mystery, or America's oldest mystery. But this framing is not quite right. It is the oldest mystery in the English-speaking American tradition, the oldest mystery in the specific historical narrative that begins with these particular expeditions and continues through Jamestown and Plymouth and onward into the history that most Americans learn in school. But the land itself is much older. The mystery of what happened to those 115 people is a small mystery, in geological or even deep human terms. A question from a single brief period in a single small place in an enormous continent with an enormous history. Before the English came, the Outer Banks held generations of human life, human mystery, human disappearance and survival and transformation. Before the Algonquian-speaking peoples, there were others. Before them, others still. The land has been a place of human habitation and human mystery for vastly longer than 4 centuries. The Roanoke mystery is, in this view, a recent addition to a much older tradition. The tradition of people appearing on shores and building lives and leaving traces and eventually becoming part of the deep past that the next people will build their own lives on top of. The tradition of every disappearance that has ever happened in this place. Every community that has transformed or ended or moved on, every person who has walked into the landscape and not come back. The land holds all of it, after a fashion. The land holds all of it in the only way land can, not as story, not as memory, but as the layered accumulation of everything that has happened in it. As depth, as the particular quality of a place that has been inhabited for a very long time by people who felt it fully, and lived in it completely and are now, from our perspective, gone. Maybe this is part of why the Roanoke mystery matters beyond its specific historical significance, because it stands at the edge of a particular kind of human experience, the experience of being in a place so fully that you are changed by it, and then the experience of being gone from the record of that place, invisible to the future people who stand where you stood and look out at the same water. The colonists of Roanoke are gone. The record of them is incomplete. The question of their fate is unanswered. But there is a sense in which they are still here, not supernaturally, not in any mystical sense, but in the ordinary, literal sense in which the past is always present in the places where it happened. In the sense in which standing on the shore of Roanoke Island and knowing the story connects you, across whatever distance, to the people who stood on that shore before you and looked out at the same water and wondered, in their own way, about the future that was coming. We are connected to them by the mystery, by the question, by the act of asking. That connection is real. Somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, the Atlantic moves in the darkness. The barrier islands lie low against the water, a thin line of land between the ocean and the sounds. The pine trees are dark shapes against the sky. The marsh grass holds its stillness. And on Roanoke Island, in the deep night that follows the last tourist and the last park ranger and the last visitor home, the island is as quiet as it has ever been. The small reconstructed earthwork of the fort sits in the shadows of the trees. The path through the woods is dark. The water of the sound is black and still. Whatever happened here is not visible. Whatever became of the 115 people who lived here and left is not knowable, not yet, perhaps not ever. The word carved into the post is long gone. The original post, the original wood, dissolved back into the ground long before any archaeologist could find it. It exists now only in John White's account, in the writing of a man who read it in 1590 and then sailed away from it and never came back. But the island holds the question. It has been holding it for 400 years and more. It will go on holding it. CROATOAN, the direction the colonists pointed toward, the name of the people who were their friends, the last message, the beginning of a mystery that has never ended. Maybe some of them arrived safely. Maybe they sat around fires on another island and told their children stories about England, stories that grew stranger and more distant with each retelling, stories that eventually became folklore, became legend, became the kind of half-remembered thing that feels like a dream. Maybe those stories are still in the world somewhere, unrecognized, carried by people who do not know what they carry. Maybe the mystery does not end at the vanishing. Maybe it continues, in changed form through the generations that followed, through the communities that absorbed the colonists if they were absorbed, through the people alive today who might carry in some small and invisible way the accumulated inheritance of that encounter, the biological inheritance, the cultural inheritance, the way that two communities that met in difficult circumstances learned to be in the world together. The answer, if it ever existed, has faded into silence, but the question has not faded, and perhaps that is enough. To carry the question, to sit with the mystery, to let the not knowing be for a moment not a frustration but a form of attention, a way of being present with people from the past who are present only as questions, who exist now only in the act of wondering about them. What happened to the people of Roanoke? Where did Virginia Dare grow up? What did Eleanor Dare tell her daughter about England, about her grandfather, about the world that was supposed to come but didn't? What did Manteo say to his people when he came home, after all he had seen? Who carved that word into the post, and what did they feel when the knife finished the last letter and they stepped back and looked at what they had written? These questions breathe in the dark. They have always breathed in the dark. And if you are drifting now, somewhere between the waking world and the dreaming one, let them drift with you, not as puzzles to be solved, but as presences to be acknowledged. Let those 115 people be real for a moment in whatever quiet space exists at the edge of sleep. Let Roanoke Island be real, the water and the trees and the night sky and the sound of the sea. Let the mystery be what it is, not a failure of knowledge, but a kind of tenderness toward the past, a recognition that the people who came before us, however far they have receded, were as fully alive as we are, that their losses were real, that their love for each other was real, that their fears were real and their hopes and the word they carved into the wood to make sure someone coming after them would know which way they went. They went toward CROATOAN. Whether they arrived, we do not know, but they tried to tell someone, and across 400 years and more in the middle of the night, in the deep quiet that follows waking and precedes dreaming, someone is still listening. If you've drifted this far with us tonight, this is where we leave you, on that shore, with the water and the stars and the long unanswered question. If you're still awake, just barely, drifting in the space between, we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if there's another mystery from the deep past you'd like to drift into, another vanished world, another forgotten shore, another question that has been breathing in the dark for longer than anyone can remember, leave us a quiet word and we'll find our way there together. Sleep well.